the Via Stoica podcast with Brendan and Benny, powered by viastoica.com, your home for coaching, workshops, quotes, and Stoic content that inspires. Welcome to the Via Stoica podcast. My name is Benny. I'm your host for today, and I'm honored to welcome such a great guest as I have today, Margaret Graver. She's the Aaron Lawrence Professor of Classics at Dartmouth College, and she's best known for her work in ancient Stoicism, where she's the author of several books, including Stoicism and Emotions, which was published in 2007 with the University of Chicago Press. It is the work we will be discussing today. Her most recent book is called Seneca, the Literary Philosopher, published in 2023 with Cambridge University Press. Thank you, Margaret. Welcome for being on the show. I'm very glad and very excited to speak to you. How are you doing today?
Hi, Benny. Thanks so much for that. I'm happy to be here. And hello, everyone.
Yeah, and it's exciting to speak to you about your book, Stoicism and Emotions, which we will be focusing on. But I wanted to ask one question before, because although we speak a lot about Stoicism on the podcast and what we do, our main goal is to really inspire people to have a philosophy of life for themselves, whether it is completely focused on Stoicism or other philosophies. And I wanted to ask, how would you describe your philosophy of life?
Well, Benny, the short answer is I don't have one. That is not in the sense in which I'm familiar with the phrase. That is, many people say my philosophy of life is this or it's this, and they'll give you a little bullet point, or a maxim, let's say. To me, philosophy is not something you have. It's something that you do. Do I have a certain approach to life? I think I probably do. But it would consist, the philosophical part of it would consist responding thoughtfully to complex situations, examining assumptions, Socrates' approach to life. That's about as much as I can say about that at this point. Yeah.
I love that answer, because it's well thought through. And I agree that some people, they just have a bullet point in life and really don't think really through or put it into practice. For example, some people say, oh, yes, I live by Stoicism and that's it. They don't really dive deeper. But
I
I
think
like how you... Sorry?
I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, because it needs that thought, right? And you need to really make it your own, but also make sure that you know why and what you are doing behind it. So I really appreciate that. And, it wasn't the answer that I was hoping for at the beginning. I don't have a philosophy of life, but the way it's spread out, it sounded like a good philosophy to begin as well. And I just wanted to ask, because you write a lot about the Stoics, and we talk about Stoicism and Emotion, but what made you write this book, Stoicism and Emotion?
Well, I had done a fair amount of previous work on Seneca. That was my topic in graduate school, Seneca's Letters. And I had written a previous book on Cicero's third and fourth Tusculan disputations, where he lays out essentially the whole Stoic philosophy of emotions as he understands it. So coming from that, I had a great desire on my own account to unfold that analysis more fully, feeling that many of the treatments of emotions in Stoicism that were out there are essentially too short. They capture one part, but they don't capture it as part of a whole system of thought around that issue. So we do need to discuss and describe what they meant by an emotion, what their issues were, how they felt that it was a voluntary action, what that means, what's voluntary about emotions and what isn't. But then also, there is a whole analysis of character that is closely connected with that. What kinds of traits predispose you to certain emotions and not others? Thinking about development through life. That's an important element to think kind of where this comes from in the course of human development. And also very important was to talk about the role of friendship and of love as those kind of emotions directed towards other people within Stoic thought. So I needed a bunch of chapters, and you can't write like short articles and just keep repeating the same analysis over and over again. It needed to be a book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it is a topic that is very under evaluated and under focused, because people usually kind of see stoicism and emotion as something quite separate, right? Which is also how you start in the introduction and how you lay that out. So I really appreciate what you did there, and how really the deep dive is important. And before, I wanted to go back and like one question on stoicism in general, but just to focus on this, did you have a specific reader in mind when you wrote this?
More than one kind of reader. So academic readers is an important part of my audience, graduate students, professors in related fields, but I wanted to have something that would make sense to people who are just readers. They are um, people who are perfectly capable of learning and reflecting on the system and just wanted to know more about it. So there are many things that academic authors do that create barriers, and want to try and take those barriers down.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job for me, and I like reading books that are right on the edge for me, where it's kind of academically and how I'm not very, my mind is not academically aligned, but this was really like perfect on that line. So I appreciate that for also thinking about me as a reader in writing the book, and you broke it down in a very nice and good way. To grasp it, but I wanted to go real quickly back to Stoicism as a philosophy, and as a professor of philosophy, how would you describe the core ideas of Stoicism?
Well, yes, thanks for that. So Stoicism it's a holistic philosophy. There is a lot of interconnected ideas. For the purposes of this conversation, the center of it, here's where I would start. What is it that is characteristic of the human being? So, what is it that makes you and me different so if I say different from animals, then everybody gets worried about chimpanzees and dogs. But let's say, what makes you different from a garter snake? Okay, maybe chimpanzees and dogs are quite a bit closer to us, but take the garter snake. Now, the snake, it has a certain kind of logic to its behavior, that you could say this is why the snake does this or that, but that's different from how human beings operate, isn't it? So we have reasons for the things we do, but we own those reasons. We may not always articulate them, but we're capable of explaining, speaking our reasons. And that for the ancient Stoics is central fact about human beings. So it's kind of where you have to start when you think about how a human being should live. You have to start with, what is a human being like? What is characteristically human? So Plato or Aristotle would talk about the function of the human being, and the Stoics do that as well. So claiming that rational nature and understanding what that means. Now, so we will be talking more about that part, but go back for a moment to the logic of the snake. We say that there are reasons for the things that all living things do. And in fact, for everything that is, there are some principles or some rules of operation that nowadays we would probably call scientific principles. That is also extremely important in ancient Stoicism. So that core intuition, of course, they're not scientists in our sense, but the core intuition that the world around us does have some fundamental logic to it, some principles that perhaps could be spelled out mathematically or at least as a logical system, so that the universe as they understand it is a single rational system. Now, they would go further than that. They would also say that's God. That is the divine nature that infuses the universe, or infuses the cosmos. Is that an anthropomorphic God? In a sense, it's connected, since the human being is a rational thing and the cosmos as a whole is a rational thing. But we are not talking about a divinity in quite the sense that many of our traditional religions now talk about it. So this is an immanent God that is infused throughout the universe and that gives a kind of a personal understanding to those broad scientific principles. So the scientific principles and the divinity are actually identified with each other, and human beings are intimately connected with that. So that's a very important part. Thinking again about systems, very important in Stoic thought is the way that the individual human being fits into social systems. So you can start with the nuclear family, but then also friendship is an extremely important theme in ancient Stoicism, love, and also community. Human communities are as important as human individuals. There is a reason why the founder of Stoicism, he starts with a book called The Republic, thinking about the city, the cosmic city of all rational beings.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I love one phrase that really stood out to me is like it's the immanent God infused in the universe, and how you, because that's a big talking point between the modern day Stoic society. Is it God? Is it the divine? Is it scientific? That kind of clashes, right? But I like how you kind of they confuse, and is it an anthropomorphic thing, right? In a way, it might be, right. It is connected because we are part of all of that together. I think that this was one of the clearest, nicest way that the core ideas of Stoicism were. I was like fascinated to listen to it. So thank you for that. And as we dive into the emotion side, like how do Stoics view emotions? Like, because this is something that people who learn about Stoicism, and that's why I really loved what you mentioned. Friendship, love, community. They're so ingrained in the philosophy, and if you delve into it deeper, something that I've experienced, the gratitude for having the people around me. Like, normally I'm in the Netherlands, at the moment I'm not, but just getting to be able to spend time with my parents still at their age, it's just fascinating. And the philosophy really helped me to build up that gratitude. So it is a philosophy of love and friendship, and I like how you highlight that. But what are the views on emotions, and what are some of the more common misconceptions that people have?
So I think we should start with what an emotion is in Stoicism, as they have some very careful definitions. So this is actually an answer that I know. So in ancient Stoicism, an emotion is a judgment. Not every judgment, but a certain kind of judgment that one makes about one situation. It has some specific parts to it that we can spell out, including a value term. So an idea about something that is either good or bad for you. And a judgment which necessarily carries with it a physiological response. Or they can also define an emotion, and I think it is equivalent, as the physiological response when it is produced by that sort of judgment. Doesn't really matter where you pin the term emotion in that story, because in all the Stoic accounts that I have studied, there has to be that judgment, and there is also that physiological component. So you feel something in your body, which is your psychic response. You feel the change in your psyche, which of course is a material thing. It's a physiological thing. And so that's what it is. It's important to add that the emotion is not just the feeling, because that feeling could actually be produced in some other way. For instance, if I gave you some kind of medication, but also there are involuntary versions of that feeling that weren't produced by such a judgment. You didn't actually have the characteristic belief structure that underlies an emotion. And then if you had that physiological response, I think about the flash of irritation, right, at the friend that didn't do anything wrong. That's not an emotion. And it is an involuntary thing, and there's not a problem with it. So you asked about misconceptions. I think there's two big ones that I would want to flag. So first, the idea that the ancient Stoics were all about suppressing the emotions across the board. Um, Folks, it's not about suppression. It's about having the emotions that are the right emotions for a human being within the context of a human life, and not having ones that are grounded in false judgments, false beliefs. Second one, and we'll talk more about that, but the second one, the idea that the Stoics are against all emotions across the board. So, in fact, in Stoicism, in its original form, there are good emotions. It's just that they might not be the comfortable ones. So, if we say, I got good emotions and bad emotions. The bad emotions are the ones that feel bad, and the good emotions are the ones that feel good. The good ones are the ones that are grounded in true judgments, and the bad ones are the ones that are grounded in false judgments. That's simple.
Yeah, that's that made me laugh because that's such a thing. Like people believe that a good emotion is something that makes me feel good, right? But for the Stoics, it's no. A good emotion is something that's based on true judgments and where your rationality lets you determine what your actions will be or what your judgments will be, right? But that's not for everybody. When they think about happiness, it's something that makes me smile. But for the Stoics, that's why they say the Stoics can feel joyous even on the rack, because he knows that what has been done is based on a true judgment. But that's one of those common misconceptions, and that's a good way to make that distinction, right, between the good emotions, what the Stoics see, how the Stoics see that, and
Exactly. So, exactly, Benny. So, actually, when you put it that way, you make me grab for my Seneca. Um,
great that you go back and you just grab it. For people not watching, it's just like the bookshelf is just incredible to look at as well.
so in the 23rd letter, do this above all, Lucilius, learn how to experience joy. And goes on to say, it's not about smiling. Real joy is a very serious matter. It might not be one that you have a smile on your lips, but it is joy. It's
Yeah,
kind
that's
of a notion of a deep joy that you would have if you really are getting life right.
And would you say that that's like, because something that I often feel that people are missing with Stoicism, that's really about the preservation of your soul and your character?
Mm-hmm.
And would then joy be more of like a deep peace and calm that you feel like, instead of like, or would that be going to, because I smile a lot, so maybe I like how you brought that up, but that sometimes it feels like for me, like it can be deep peace and calm, even though you might be busy with a lot of things or things that you might not want to be doing.
Well, I think that one can, so they use the word uplift. And that term describes a feeling. The same exact term is used to describe the ordinary emotion of delight. So what you feel when got an invitation to a birthday party and you went whee inside, right? That is also the term for the joy of the wise person. So I don't think it's just a matter of tranquility. I think Stoic joy is, in Seneca's conception, something that feels great. It's just that it comes from the recognition that I'm doing a really good thing. So for a sort of simple example, you could think about the joy of giving. maybe is a kind of the type of example that we should be thinking of.
Yeah, I like that. That it's about that. Is that also part of the where you mentioned like the expanding, right, or the contracting, like the 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 kind of bad emotions they yeah no I think that that's a good thing to remember when we talk about emotions, because people, I don't think like, when people talk about emotions, they're not really sure what they mean by emotions themselves, or when they talk about them specifically, when they talk about happiness, when they talk about angry, I'm not sure that they really think about like what it really means for them and for like the bigger picture. So I think that that's it's really good to have that clear.
It is one thing that the ancient Stoics have to offer us is they really, they didn't have phones, they didn't have TV. They sat down and worked through some of these concepts and thought carefully about how exactly they're using their words, coming up with some definitions, and thinking about how exactly the system fits together, to the extent to where they're classifying the emotions. They have this elaborate classification and set of definitions for the different emotions, um, that we probably don't need to go into how exactly that works in this conversation, but it's there. So they always have the option, having given a definition. So if you had an example that you say, well, here's a case where your analysis doesn't work, they have the option of saying, no, that's everything you say is true, but I wouldn't consider that to be an emotion.
And I think that that's and I like those deep conversations is something that we could definitely need more in our present society instead of just following what's on our screens and everything. So I really and that makes that could extend the dialogues or the conversation that we have, at least when we're talking about the same things, right? To get a foundation ready for a good proper dialogue. And building on that,
Yes.
yeah, go.
Yeah, I should probably add that, with that said, what I just said, when the Stoics sit down and list what they include under the term pathos, I mean, obviously they're not speaking English, they're speaking Greek. So when they use their word pathos for an emotion, the kinds of things that they list include gladness, anger, fear, grief, desire. So, because those are also the very words that we list under our term emotion, that's what gives me confidence that the phrases that are used in the ancient record are talking about emotions as we understand them. So, you will have some, if you read widely, then you will see some authors insist on, for instance, the term passions rather than the term emotions. They're looking at the same Greek words that I'm looking at. But they're concerned about how exactly these things are defined, and there's a lot to it. But I'm convinced that it need not be an extreme instance of anger to count as an emotion that the Stoics might be concerned about. Even a low level fear, let's say, worry, anxiety, these things, it's about the cognitive structure of it, the belief structure that underlies the emotion. That's what makes it count as an emotion that I need to examine and perhaps get rid of, versus a good emotion, which I can embrace.
Yeah, I think that that's important, and I loved how you added that as well to the conversation, because it is important for the context of this conversation as well. And how do you believe our how do our beliefs and thoughts influence the emotions that we experience?
Okay, yes, good. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to look at this a little more closely. So I'm going to use the word belief. So a thought that I'm committed to is a belief. When you think about forming a new belief, you have a thought and you commit to it. That's an assent. What determines whether you give that assent, whether you endorse or embrace an idea? Well, it's actually the beliefs you already have. That's how rational creatures work. We make decisions, we make choices, we make mental commitments in relation to the existing contents of our minds. So I did say that an emotion is a certain kind of judgment. So let's think about what that looks like. All of us are walking around since childhood with a collection, maybe not very well organized, but we all have a collection of what I call evaluative beliefs. So we think that certain things are good for ourselves, and we think that certain things are bad for ourselves. We haven't necessarily examined those assumptions. We got them from our parents or, the people that raised us, the culture, the books we read, and so forth. But those are a big part of our mental apparatus, and they're going to have a big part in our emotional lives. Then, in addition, we're walking around with a collection of beliefs about what kinds of responses are appropriate, like the thing to do, let's say, um, when confronted with something that triggers one of those evaluative beliefs. So these are actually simpler. Um, you and I both harbor a belief that when we are confronted with something bad, we should be afraid. If something bad is about to happen, we should have an aversive feeling. And that when something that's bad for us is actually present in our lives, it's, let's say, just happened, that we should be depressed or down in some way. There's different flavors of it, but basically the idea, I think of it almost as like a structural belief in the human mind that when an evil or a bad thing is present to me, I should, they would say, contract my psyche, but I almost want to say just have that sad feeling. So if you're walking around with those, you're basically set up. You're like a smoke detector, as it were. And then when smoke comes into your environment, when something happens, a new judgment presents itself, and it would take the form something like a bad thing is about to happen. X and Y, which is a bad thing, is about to happen. When you add that to the first two, you're going to assent to that complex judgment. So now I have the complex judgment itself, which is something like, given that thing X, which is a bad thing for me, has just happened, and given that when a bad thing is present, I should be depressed, I'm going to be depressed. That's the conclusion, the logical conclusion, given the set of premises. So it's important to add to that picture that as rational beings, we do have mechanisms for amending our beliefs. We can change them, not instantly, but with examination, with some perhaps philosophical training, if we should be so lucky as to have someone to discuss these things with. But even on our own, we can think things through, we can examine, does that actually make sense? Is that thing that I've always thought was a bad thing, is it really? Is it really so bad for me to have that? Or is it really so good for me? So like a simple example is money. Lots of people have gotten that far. Is money actually a good always in my life? If it's good, it should always be good. Is it? Um, and then you can take it further to some of the harder cases. But the rational creature, when presented with a contradiction, where maybe I have some other principles that seem more true, when I recognize that contradiction, I will revise my beliefs. So that comes into the structure of our minds. You can call it character if you want, because your belief set is your character. So, right. So when you are having a response that's on the basis of false beliefs, that's a problem. Not because of the way it feels, but because it's based on a falsehood. And we have a calling as rational creatures to fix and get rid of the false beliefs that we're harboring. And similarly, if you are having a physiological response on the basis of a true judgment about your situation, that's a good emotion. That's the difference.
Yeah, I love that, and if I'm correct, you used in your book for the evaluative beliefs, the birth of a child, where you're in the womb, it's nice and warm, that feels good. Being born, you come outside, it's cold, that doesn't feel good, and then being held in a towel or against the mother's chest and feel warm again. So are those are the set of evaluative beliefs that we already get from very early on, right? If I'm correct.
Yeah, that's an ancient example, in fact.
Okay.
So I won't go into the details, but I didn't make that one up. That came from the Greek sources. And that's one explanation for where the virtually universal belief that pleasure is a good comes from. Already in infancy, before you can understand language even, your very situation has presented you with being wrapped in that nice, warm, fluffy towel as an infant. And okay, so two things happened there. One, it was pleasurable. And two, you had something happen that preserved you as an organism. And the two things are tightly connected. The pleasure actually arises from the good thing that happened to you for your preservation as an organism. It floats on top, as it were. The pleasure is, in fact, in the Stoic account, it's a byproduct, a side effect, as it were, of something that actually was good for you. But how's the baby going to make that fine distinction, right? They're not. And then, of course, we get many, many direct verbal messages from the people around us, our caregivers, and so forth, that tell us pretty explicitly that pleasure is something desirable. You did something good, here's a piece of candy.
Yeah, or like, here's a lot of money, this is going to give you pleasure, and then
Right.
that's it.
Right.
Whereas,
Congratulations, you got all that money, and
yeah,
everybody says that. So
yeah,
naturally, we think that money is a good.
yeah,
And conversely with the more difficult things in life.
yeah, yeah, and it's because people win the lottery, they're very happy, but I think it's about 70 or 80% of them 3 years later they're worse off. So it's something. Be careful what you wish for, and I think that's the but having the proper belief behind it is like, okay, what is it that's really truly happening? I think that's an important distinction to make here, and you spent some and talking about this as well, like you mentioned a little bit, that we can have these mechanisms in place to amend these beliefs. And that brings it kind of to the topic of the voluntariness of the emotions. So you spent some time on this Stoic idea, right? About that the emotions are actually voluntary actions. But what does that mean in practical terms?
Well, so we've said the basic model is that an emotion is a judgment that we make on the basis of beliefs that we already have. It is a response to our situation that came from that action guiding element of belief. So when a bad thing is present to me, I should react this way. When an injustice is done to me, I should react this way. I should react maybe violently or something like that. It's defined as a decision that maybe you're not fully aware you were making a decision, but if you were asked later, you would be able to say, okay, well, here's what made me think that. Here's what made me react that way. Normally, that's just the kind of creature we are. We're able to do that. Maybe we need a little therapy sometimes to get fully to the bottom of it. But yes, that's, as a general account, we do actually know why we responded that way. Now, it doesn't follow that in that moment when you are violently angry, let's say, or terribly afraid, that you can just stop on a dime. You can't. And that is important to realize. When they say an emotion is a judgment, they're not saying that it's a judgment that you can instantly reverse. I talk about this a good bit. So people do all kinds of crazy things under the influence of emotion, as if, even if they want to stop, they can't. So in that moment when you want to stop that reaction and you're unable to, that emotion is going to feel involuntary to you. So Chrysippus, one of the Stoic founders, has an analogy that he uses. He talks about running. So when you're running, especially if you're running downhill, is that a voluntary action? Sure, right? No question about that. And yet, if you're running downhill, you have momentum. You can't stop instantly. That's just a kind of action that running is. Anger works like that. You can't stop being angry instantly. And yet, you did actually decide to be angry. There was a judgment that underlies your anger. Otherwise, we wouldn't consider it to be anger. It would be something else. Um, so voluntary in that sense, thinking about at the moment the judgment is made. An important addition to that would be circling back to the formation of character. So as we were just saying, you do have the opportunity, because you're a rational creature who can think things through, examine your assumptions, examine whether they make sense. Maybe you did get angry that time and you couldn't stop it. But you can, now that that rush of anger is over, you can think about what went into it. Examine, was the underlying value actually something that was that important? Was there actually an evil or a good present to me in that situation? What is actually good for a human being? What is actually bad for him? It's a pretty short list, actually, right? So, um, what's good for a person? It's living a good life, exercising your rational nature, caring for your community, so exhibiting virtues like courage, justice, generosity. Those are the good things for a human life. Is that what I got upset about? Maybe not. So that you have the opportunity to circle back and fix that anger for next time.
Yeah, and that's something that and I'm, there's always this questions in my head if I actually do it properly. But if I look back at when I started, trying to practice stoicism more in my life, I've felt like my anxiety levels have gone and my angers have gone because of that. Asking myself, so why am I getting angry? What am I getting angry about? And also reminding myself that, okay, this has happened, something that I didn't really desire, or my aversions have actually come to fruition, but I can still be a good person. I can still do the right thing. And that has, for me, noticeably helped and changed my life, and to bring it that more, to make better decisions in that moment. And I liked how that analogy that you used with anger and running. Sometimes it does feel that way, right? And building on that question that I have, because when I talk to people about this, or listen to other conversations, I hear that people say, but I'm a human. These are human emotions. I have right to feel these emotions. I have right to be angry, and but how would a Stoic reply to those statements when they say, like, oh, this is my emotion, I should have this, I feel a right that I have it?
Well, the ancient Stoics would be a little bit baffled by the statement phrased that way, because of the word right. So in ancient Greece and Rome, maybe especially in Rome, there was such a thing as a right legally. Just as for us, there are legal rights, things that the government cannot, has bound itself legally not to keep you from doing. But that doesn't seem particularly relevant here. Stoicism is not a government telling you what you can do or restricting you in any way. And there's also the sense of right in that I can do something and be right to do it. But they've just said that this is something that, if you're getting your underlying beliefs wrong, is actually wrong to do. So the whole thing just kind of doesn't fit for them. But I think we might want to just respond to the underlying thought of the person that has told you this thing, which I'm going to guess now. I'm guessing that what the person really means is one of two things. Either they mean, well, I'm only human. It's inevitable that I'm going to have feelings. That's part of what we think it is to be human, is to be vulnerable. Or perhaps they mean there are some things that sure look like emotions that I'm completely right to feel. within my rights, as it were, to feel that, meaning it's a correct emotion. So the ancient Stoics, to the first one, the inevitable one, would say, no, it isn't inevitable because of what we were just saying. So you know from experience, and I think many of us know from experience, that reflection, examination of views, some of what we used to call values clarification, does actually help with the regulation of emotions. Now, we are not perfect at it. We have not finished that process. We are still going to respond with completely unjustified emotions in many situations in life. Granted, if we did actually work life out fully and actually did fully embrace the idea that what matters in human life is behaving justly, courageously, sensibly, generously, then we would respond accordingly. We would have that reaction on the basis of the true values in Stoic life, in the Stoic system, and not on the basis of the things that are actually not valuable in the Stoic system. So at that point, you talk about the Stoic sage. But even if we're not there, we make progress toward it. So the idea that the emotion is inevitable, I get where the person is coming from, since you don't have a lot of us that have completed that perfecting of our character. I don't expect to perfect my character during my lifetime. And I don't imagine from your expression, I'm guessing that you don't either. um, but we do get better, right? So not inevitable, or at least not completely inevitable. We can affect our reactions. To the second thought, there are some situations in which I am right to be angry. Absolutely. I think the Stoic system gives you room to say that. So there are some situations in which you are confronted with something that is genuinely good. Now, you might have to be the Stoic sage in the way they think about it. You might need to be the Stoic sage to fully embrace this idea of the good emotions. But if you were, I mean, go back to my example of the generous giver who feels joy in giving. If you're doing it right on the basis of your character for the right reasons and so forth, sounds a little Aristotelian, but I think it is both Stoic and Aristotelian. The joy that you take in that response, you have every right to that. You should have that reaction. Response to the true values might include, even for an imperfect person, a repugnance at doing things that are wrong. So if you take something fairly simple, I think I used in my book the reaction to the idea that you might molest a child. If you feel a horrified reaction to that, both a Stoic sage and a mere progressor like you and me can have that repugnance, right? And that's actually important for moral progress, to have a feeling-based reaction to that. Not merely thinking it's wrong, but a horror at that kind of idea. So that was the last chapter of my book that most people never get to. But to think about that role and the importance of that type of reaction.
Oh, and I love the last chapter, and I think that was a nice one to slightly, curve the conversation a little bit differently. And I think that don't they say, like, I've read these things where they say if people smile or laugh when they look at these Netflix series about Dahmer and these serial killers, then maybe there's something there's something wrong, right? So that's that's a really important thing. And I wonder, because I get these views about the book that people say, oh, it's difficult to read, but sometimes it feels like, and especially when we talk about emotions and the progress that we can make, right, that people have a blockade because of their own responsibility and duty in it to reflect on these beliefs and the judgment that they make. And it sometimes feels that people, and it reminds me of this quote that is usually attributed to Freud, but it's by this guy called McGee. He says, like, people don't want freedom because freedom requires taking responsibility, and most people are afraid of responsibility. Is that, at least that's the feeling that I get, that people kind of block when they hear this, that you can actually work on your emotional reaction, that you can work on those beliefs and the judgments that they're based on, and then maybe even diminish the influence of that the triggers have. I don't know if that's something that you've noticed as well, that some people kind of block there because they don't think that it is possible, especially because the Stoics put the Stoic sage up there as like, this is what we should be, knowing fully that it's, like you mentioned, for me as well, it's, yeah, I don't see myself reaching there in a lifetime.
One of my favorite stories in Epictetus. I mean, Epictetus dealt with this kind of thing too, right? He's constantly interacting with people who come to him from various backgrounds with various issues. And one of the stories that I love is a father who says he has just come from the bedside of his desperately ill daughter. And what he says is, I couldn't stand it. I got so upset that I had to just leave the room. And Epictetus is not impressed. Not a bit. And he says, look, did the mother leave the room? How can you think that that was an inevitable reaction that you had? You've got an example right here of somebody who didn't respond that way. And so he says, do you think you were right to do that? Do you think that was the right response? And the father says, well, it was natural. And Epictetus won't give him natural. The natural response is to care for your family member, even when things get very, very difficult. So where's the responsibility of the father there? It's not about how he feels. It's about what he's required to do because of the family structure that he's in. And it could have been a larger community. It could have been just a friend. It could have even been a responsibility to himself. But to frame it in terms of, I mean, the old word was duty. I'm a little more comfortable with the word responsibility. Or another way to put it, what's appropriate? You know what's actually appropriate? We do lots of things because we think they're the thing to do. Everything we do, in a way, we think it's the right thing to do or the appropriate thing to do in that moment. But we're not always right about that. Some people are doing the appropriate thing. Hopefully, as a progressor, we do the actually appropriate thing more and more often. If you were the Stoic sage, you would actually know what's the right thing to do, and you would do that.
Yeah, and that's the, and we try, right? I think that's also, we try our best to do the most appropriate thing in the situation. And I really love that story by Epictetus as well, where it's, yeah, because he wanted, like, he was so, he loved this child so much that he couldn't bear seeing her ill, right? And I remember reading a story in an interview by a modern day Stoic as well. He has done some Stoic camps in the US, and his daughter was ill, and he said, yes, it is very bad. I don't like seeing my child, but now what is my role? What is my responsibility to be the best caregiver and to take care? And that gave him strength to do what he had to do while it was still difficult, right? While it was still tough to do. And to build on that, like, what would a Stoic's response to an emotion look like in practice? For example, when they are facing with a situation that threatens their own well-being or something similar.
Okay, so let's think about that. So we imagine an ancient Stoic, perhaps a modern Stoic, someone who's taking seriously these ideas. And they've just learned that they have an incurable disease. You get that big C diagnosis. How does the Stoic respond to that? So remember, we said there are involuntary physiological responses. It may well be that in that moment, even the perfected Stoic is going to tremble, was one of the ancient ideas. They might experience shock. They may turn pale. They might faint, all without having said a horrible thing has happened. This is where it gets difficult. Has a horrible thing actually happened? So if I'm going to believe that, I have to believe that my own death is the worst possible thing that can happen. Well, is it? Everybody dies. I wasn't planning on dying this year. It's gonna take a while to adjust to absorb that. Um, but people can, we say, come to terms with something. Is that an easy doctrine? No. But hanging on to the idea that, okay, what is important in a human life? What are the horrible things? If I'm to respond in some terrible way to that diagnosis, if I go away and do some terrible thing because of that diagnosis, then that is not responding the way that the Stoic model, Stoic ethics suggests one should respond. But responding to it courageously, you would actually be in the presence of a good. I don't know if you're younger than I am, but you surely remember the 9/11 attacks and George Bush coming up and saying, "Oh, there was, tremendous evil today." And I remember thinking, well, where exactly was the evil in that situation? So we would grant him for sure that there was evil present to the people who were hijacking those planes. Well, I mean, I don't know them, but let's just give him that this was a terrible thing to do, and that evil that was there was present to the people who did that evil. What about on the ground? What about around the World Trade Center? There was a lot of good. There was tremendous good that day. There was tremendous courage that was shown, tremendous care for other people, heroism by the firefighters and so forth. And I just remember being struck that in Stoic terms, the evil didn't lie where President Bush thought it lay. Complete kind of reorientation of how we're using those terms. Yeah.
Yeah, and we again, we jump to conclusions very quickly with those terms of evil and good. And I think it was Eric Weiner in one of his books. He said like one great act of evil, if you will, is usually contrasted by thousands of acts of love and good, as you mentioned as well, like on the ground and people coming together and building up that community. So I think that that's a great way of putting it, and especially when we think about how do we react to those evils and to those bad things, right? To when we actually have those initial voluntary involuntary emotions and beliefs that this is a diagnosis that has been bad. And I remember talking to someone on Spaces on X that we used to do, and he was diagnosed with cancer, but he used that as to set an example and help other people who were diagnosed and help them get through that initial response. And from that, he gained strength to help people. So that became his kind of mission, if you will, and he got a real good out of that bad thing, right? There's a sense of purpose that he got from it. So I think that that's something to think about when we get those initial things. And it takes time, right? It takes time to absorb the shock because it's not something that we want, and that's something that Epictetus keeps hammering on, right? The desires and aversions, and then it takes especially the bigger it gets, it takes some getting used to, but then there's still possibility as we progress it and as we digress it, then we can process it. Sorry, then we can find the good part of that as well. And as we,
Yeah, I
as we,
think
yeah,
the time element is really important to emphasize. I love the way that you kind of framed that in terms of the time, because nobody is expecting us to be superhuman. Um, right? That we are sensitive creatures. That's part of what it is to be a human. And that shock, that fear, those initial reactions actually show our humanity. It's just that they don't define necessarily what the actual response is going to be.
yeah, I love that. That and that's something that I felt like, because I like to talk about the pause. We have a newsletter called The Pause to just kind of take a breather. And
Yeah,
what I've
Epictetus's
realized is,
pause.
yeah, and what I've realized is that first the pause by practice becomes shorter, right? So now, and before I'd stumble my toe against the bed in the morning, I would grumble and for a few, and maybe even let it ruin my day. And I would just take a deep breath, and I feel like it's better already, right? So the pause gets shorter, and it feels like I can put it closer to what triggered that response, right? So you can, and I like that visual for myself, that okay, I can shorten that and I can move it closer and closer, and that feels like the progress that I'm trying to make, as like we try to let our rational minds and take over and really analyze what's happening, right? And to get that true belief and let that base my response on that as well.
Yeah, good for you.
And as we start to wrap this up, I wanted to ask one more question, and something that we've people talk about many times is like, why do you think Stoicism is becoming more popular in this current time, and what is lacking, what is Stoicism lacking in its current form?
Well, of course, we don't have a single culture these days, but if I can generalize, I hate to generalize, but speaking broadly, a lot of things have changed in 21st century culture from what people experienced a century ago, 2 centuries ago. And one big thing is religion is much less central to life. And it has left a lot of people who maybe at one time would simply have gone with whatever religion they were raised in, looking for something that can help them frame the world around them. Looking for something to live by, but also something to understand the world through. There are many places one can go for that are healthy and valuable places to go. But a reaction against popular culture is going to be a good idea at some point for virtually all of us. So Stoicism is one way that many people have found that's helpful. I do not think Stoicism is a religion, but it has played some of that role that religion once played in people's lives. So maybe answers the first part. Now, what is lacking? There's at this point, the modern Stoicism movement's been going for quite a while now, and there's a number of different understandings of what that actually involves out there now. Some of those versions, I think, present themselves too much as being basically a coping mechanism for the individual, as if it's ultimately all about your comfort in living your life. And as we have been discussing, that's actually not a very immature understanding of what Stoicism has to offer. If you're not thinking in terms of responsibilities to other people, responsibilities to yourself as a creature, um, and responsibilities to the planet, then I don't think you have really understood what the system is about. So social structures, respect for the earth, respect for the divine as a very big piece of ancient Stoicism that's a little bit hard for us to know what to do with in such a secular culture as we live in. So let's just say you define the divine the way that you need to define it, but a kind of reverence for the beauty and mystery of life, it was a big part of ancient Stoicism that I wish could be a little bit more claimed in some of the versions of modern Stoicism.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful said, the beauty and mystery, right? And that's something that I've seen on my journey as well, like before. And I like how you mentioned that a lot of people see it, or well, there's a group who see it as a coping mechanism, right? Something that just protects me and puts me in a comfortable place. But the more I read and see it, it's, as you mentioned in your book as well, it's about love and friendship and about the mystery and examining yourself. For me, that's the best journey that we can go on, right? To understand myself better and the world around us, and having that sense of feeling. And then you can see that there is a big community out there. And I think that that's kind of what is um, taking over from what the religion has given us first, right? That community where we come together, where we feel comfortable together, we're doing the same thing. And here it is philosophizing and talking about it and understanding ourselves and the world around us. There's a big mystery out there in the world, and that we should see that beauty and embrace it far more than trying to reject it all and be that, that stoic brick wall that many people talk about.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. It was really nice to speak to you, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I do implore people to go and read until the very end, Stoicism and Emotions. And I'm definitely going to pick up your latest book, Seneca, the literary philosopher, because that sounds a very interesting next read. And I will share everything for people to find. And if I'm not sure if how you are on social media, but if people want to find you, where could they do that?
They would probably just go to the little web page that's put up at Dartmouth College for me if they want some references. I don't have a whole lot on there, but there's some links.
Okay, good. And I'll send the links for people where they can find your books and everything, because I do believe that this is an important, but it opened my eyes towards Stoicism and emotion. So I think people should definitely pick it up. So thank you very much for writing that and for bringing that to the community.
That's my pleasure. It's been a nice conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Via Stoica podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review. Your feedback will help us reach more like-minded people on the journey to self-improvement. If you want to get in touch with us or find more information, you can go to viastoica.com, your one-stop platform for all things Stoicism and living better. And remember, virtue is the only good.